Hello, friends. We are in a troubling time when it comes to misinformation. Here at Forbidden Knowledge News, I've always taken an unbiased, open-minded, and responsible approach to presenting my own theories, and the views of our guests do not reflect that of my own. This show is for entertainment purposes only, and any information presented during this show is a live-action role-play scenario. Conspiracies are definitely fun to discuss in a responsible way. My suggestion to everyone that has an audience and presents theories and possibilities should present them as such, and in no way present unsubstantiated information as truth. All that being said, enjoy this episode. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Hans Deitrich. First, a couple of announcements. Check out our affiliate, Brainsupreme. Brainsupreme provides the highest quality ingredients to start your microdosing journey. And right now, until November 1st, you get 25% off your order when you use code FKN25 at checkout, or just click the link right in the description. Start your microdosing journey today. Also, watch the Forbidden documentary, Occult Louisiana. That's available on Tubi and multiple streaming platforms. Also, get a Rokfin premium membership, rokfin.com/FKN Plus, and always download the podcast directly through Spreaker. Today I want to welcome Hans Deitrich. He is a graphic designer and esoteric researcher studying ancient sites and civilizations. He researches occult symbology found in history, logos, film, and media, as well as NASA-related conspiracy theories. Hans, welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Chris? Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on. Very much looking forward to discussing your research into some of our favorite topics here, our hidden ancient past, esoteric symbolism, as well as some conspiratorial information you've researched about NASA. Lots of stuff to get into, but this is your first time on. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and what brought you down your path.
So I'm a graphic designer, and years ago I had a horrific accident, and it basically put me in a chair for a while, basically sitting in front of my desk. And I dove into a lot of research, and I started getting into esoteric knowledge and started realizing there were some overlaps with my past. I grew up in Kathmandu, Nepal, for your audience that doesn't know this. And while living there, I'm surrounded by, this very, very ancient culture. And there's a lot of mysticism and magic and sorcery that goes on in the Nepalese culture. And at a young age, I started getting into the Mahabharata and all sorts of different, storylines that come out of this area of the world. Primarily, I then started getting into, basically, in the last few years, esoteric research into ancient sites, civilizations, as well as occult symbology that you find throughout history, in logos, in media, and in film. And I've also started realizing that part of my studies overlapped with my thesis. And so I did my thesis in Bhutan. I was there for 2 months on a special access visa in 1998. Bhutan is notoriously difficult to get into. You basically have to be invited. They allow 2,000 tourists at that time per year. And the cost of your visa is anywhere from $300 to $600 a day, depending on what season you're there. And you're allowed 10 days. This doesn't include room, board, or transportation. Anyway, I was doing my studies there on Buddhist cultural mysticism and ancient art and architecture, because Bhutan, after China invaded Tibet in the 1950s, Bhutan has some of the oldest remaining Buddhist art and architecture in the world. So I was incredibly fascinated by this. But while I was there, I came across a group of nomadic people called the Dropa. And a couple of years ago, another researcher kind of challenged me to look up as much as I could about the Dropa stones. And I started realizing that there was an overlap with some of the research I had done when I was there with my thesis. I also study, as I said, occult symbology, but I also study AI in the movies. I'm into basically the mysteries of Shambhala and the people that have been seeking Shambhala, and a bunch of other things, including some interesting NASA conspiracies. Just for the record, I'm not here to totally rag on NASA, but there are some definite mysteries within their ranks. As Hoagland always puts it, never a straight answer, right?
Yeah.
And also, I'm not a flat earther, so we'll get that out of the way. But there are some controversies within some of NASA's conspiracies that people automatically say, "Oh, you're getting into this conspiracy. You must be a flat earther,"
Right.
which is ridiculous. So anyway, that's a little bit about my background.
Perfect. Great introduction. Let's start with a little bit of your research into our ancient past, starting with Buddhist mysticism. This isn't anything I've regularly covered on the show, so I'm very interested in finding out a little bit more about what you'd learned.
Certainly. So I wrote a book, shameless plug early on, called Dropa, Legends and Lore, where I'm connecting the mysteries of basically Bhutan, China, Nepal, Tibet, and Sirius. And Sirius is interesting because in a lot of Buddhist practice, you don't hear about Sirius because you're researching into more of the prominent styles of Buddhism. But in Bhutan, they have a very rare sect of Buddhism called Nyingmapa Buddhism. And this is where we get all the stories of levitation, levitating monks, astral projection, ascended Tulku masters, the legends of Mount Meru as a dimensional portal stemming from deep in the earth at the sacred city of Shambhala through the 7 chakras of the dimensions. So the Shambhala would be your base chakra, and the crown chakra would be the summit of Mount Meru. Well, in Buddhist philosophy, the summit connects to the brightest star that rises in the east, which is Sirius, by a rainbow bridge. And so this is where we start learning about astral projection and these Tulku masters having the ability to use the spiritual meditational technology of astral projection to project themselves across the dimensions of time, space, to different realms, to different planet systems, to different star systems, to different galaxies. And so I started getting really fascinated with this and figured, okay, let's find out a little bit more about the Buddhist connection to Sirius. And so while I was studying in Bhutan, my teacher and translator named Tashila, he would take me into these different rooms in the Lakongs and Zongs, the monasteries there, and basically start translating what was on the walls. And it was fascinating because he took me into the first room, and the first room was this dark room. Everything was painted in black. He called it the forbidden room because there were depictions of, demons having sex with humans, demons devouring humans. The how do you say it? The forbidden acts of the Kama Sutra. Also depictions of ascended Tulku masters, and also depictions of Mount Meru and the 4 gifts from Mount Meru. And so the 4 gifts from Mount Meru came down from Sirius about 20,000 years ago, supposedly, allegedly, and were found on the summit of Mount Meru. And they consisted of these 4 items. And the first item is called the Sintamani stone. And so the Sintamani stone is considered a shard of a meteor, basically, that fell from Sirius. And for those who possess this shard or the full meteor, you're granted longevity of life, prosperity, similar aspects to what the alchemists, portray as the philosopher's stone, basically, in a sense. The second item in the box was the Vajra Dorje. The Vajra Dorje is a 4-sided lightning or thunderbolt, and it represents the 4, the 4 winds, the 4 seasons. the four elements in a sense, and it helped basically become a pillar stone for Vajrayana Buddhism, which is slightly different. The third item in the box is called Buddha's Singing Bowl, or the Singing Bowl. And basically, when it is strummed and oscillated, it creates a frequency that a meditating monk can use to go into deeper states of transcendental meditation. And then the fourth item in the box is called the Om Mani stone, or the Mani stone. And it's usually a round stone or a circular disc that has the engravement of Om Mani Padme Hum written upon it. And Om Mani Padme Hum literally translates to the jewel within the sacred lotus. Well, if your pineal gland, or if your crown chakra is the sacred lotus, then the jewel within the sacred lotus would be the seat of consciousness, your pineal gland. And when you repeat Om Mani Padme Hum, going into deeper meditation, this can also take you into an altered state of transcendental meditation, in a sense. And since both our pineal gland and the lotus flower itself synthesize small amounts of DMT, I could see, somebody with a clear mind being able to access that and having more of a lucid meditational experience.
So I want to go back to, you mentioned Mount Meru. It's very interesting. I had a guest on the other day giving his interpretations based on some different ancient texts that refer to Mount Meru, and these were basically referring to it as a physical location, but based on these interpretations, it's a spiritual representation of our chakras.
Yes, correct. So it is a very physical mountain. It's located pretty much on the border of Ladakh in northwestern Tibet. However, if you look up Mount Meru online, you're going to find a picture of a mountain with a very interesting volcano associated with it. And this is Mount Meru in Africa. And it's interesting that they've named this place the same name. Mount Meru is fascinating because it does show up as a dimensional portal. All of the different dimensions within it are occupied by dimensional beings, and they're all guarded by these creatures called the Nagas. And so the Nagas are often depicted as being half serpent, half human. We see this throughout other cultures, like Medusa was also considered one of these Nagas. If you've ever watched the movie The Golden Child, there's a depiction in there of this woman who supposedly one of her ancestors was molested by a dragon, and so she's like half dragon, half human. And so we start seeing, a little bit more notation around the Nagas. And getting into, some more of what I was studying in Bhutan, in this, I guess you call it a tome of poetry and beautiful philosophy. It was discovered about 100 BC. It's much older than that, but it's called the Lotus Sutra. And in it are a couple of depictions of these ascended masters. And one of them, his name was Mahamad Galgyana, and he was a disciple of Sakyamuni, who we know in the West as Siddhartha. We're told in the West that Siddhartha was the first Buddha, but in actuality, he was most likely the 1000th reincarnate of the great Buddha, which exists in Shambhala and lives there as the guardian of the world, basically. And during meditation one day, Mahamad Galgyana decides, I'm going to try and ascend the dimensional portals of Mount Meru so that I may hear the beautiful voice of Buddha from the summit. And upon doing so and going through these different dimensional challenges, he reaches the summit and he hears the great voice of Buddha. And he asks Sakyamuni, can you grant me the technology and technique to travel across the Rainbow Bridge to the brightest star in the east of Sirius? He's granted the technique and the technology. He crosses the Rainbow Bridge across the dimensions of time and space to the realm around Sirius, where he's met by a race of giants. And they think he's a little tiny bug or, a Coke can to crush, until one of them realizes that he has the energy and aura of being one of the disciples of Sakyamuni, who is renowned in the Buddhist world around the universe, in a sense. And so they bid him apology. They ask if he can meditate with them before he returns to the earthly realm. And once he returns to Earth, he's granted the title of Bodhisattva, which is somebody who's reached a state of enlightenment within their own lifetime. But instead of ascending to become a light being, they decide to stay through compassion to help the rest of us through our suffering. He was known to be able to fly, levitate, fly, and also anthropomorphically project himself into other creatures and beings. Another character that comes out of this that is somewhat associated with Mount Meru, his name is Drakpa Gyaltsen. So Drakpa is a transliteration of Dropa, Drokpa, Zopa, Brokba, and Drukba. And so in Bhutan, Bhutan is known as Druk. Druk means the cloud dragon or the land of the cloud dragons. And so if you see something coming out of the sky and you don't really know what it is, and you have dragons in your mythology, you're going to go, "Wow, this smoking creature is coming out of the sky. We're going to call it a cloud dragon." But this is also where this word, Dropa and Drokpa come from. So Drakpa Gyaltsen comes to us from about 1600 AD out of Bhutan, and he was known to be able to go into deep states of meditation and levitate himself and his ritual instruments. And it's fascinating because when you see depictions of him in the Thangka paintings, he's shown in different states of meditation. And the third state of meditation, he's in lotus position. He's flying on a rainbow toward the east from the summit of Mount Meru. And so here we have, again, this interesting dimensional connection with a very physical place. And this could all, in a sense, be a metaphor for the Milky Way, because when you're in the Himalayas and you're way up in the Tibet Plateau, you don't have light pollution from the cities or city lights. And so when you look at the night sky, the Milky Way is this beautiful rainbow of colors and stars that stretch from the top of the mountains all the way to the eastern horizon where Sirius rises. And so there's this spiritual and metaphysical transformation of Mount Meru and the Milky Way.
What are your thoughts about... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there's a third descendant master, but his name is Gadgad Savara. He also comes to us from the Lotus Sutra. And in the Lotus Sutra, it is described that Manjusuri, another disciple of Sakyamuni, is in deep meditation one day. And in deep meditation, he is visited by an astral being who calls himself Gadgad Savara. And Manjusuri is confused because he's never met anybody in deep meditation. He's just been in his own thoughts. And he asks, "Are you real?" And Gadgad Savara says, "Yes, and I'll prove it by leaving you 7 jeweled lotus flowers. When you come out of meditation, you will find them." And so he comes out of meditation, and he's surrounded by these 7 jeweled lotus flowers. And he freaks out. He's like, "Oh no, what's going on here?" And so he goes to Sakyamuni, and he asks, "Who is Gadgad Savara, and how is he able to visit me in my astral meditation?" And Sakyamuni says, Gadgad Savara is a sage or a bodhisattva from a realm that is around the brightest star that rises in the east, the star of Sirius. This is all in poetic verse, of course, and so you kind of got to read between some of the lines of how they're describing things. But when you start looking up what some of the things they're describing are, it makes a lot more sense. And so he's able to come to you in meditation because he has mastered the meditational spiritual technology of astral projection. Well, how can I learn this technique? How can I meet him again in the astral plane? Well, because you're not initiated, you will have to be guided into a deeper state of meditation by another practitioner. So he does this. He meets with Gadgad Savara on the astral plane, and he asks him, "Can you come visit us physically in your physical form on Earth?" And Gadgad Savara says yes and accepts the challenge. And it's said that he then climbs atop his tall flying palace, a tower of 7 layers. So here's another connection to Mount Meru in that ideology, the 7-layered tower. And accompanied by the sounds of hundreds of thousands of musical instruments being played without players, here we have this cacophony of sound, he traverses in an instant across the dimensions of time and space and arrives at Earth. He comes down from the clouds in his tall tower. He descends with his disciples. He's depicted as being short in stature, golden glowing skin, eyes blue within blue, and bluer than the bluest jeweled lotuses. So similar to what you'd see in Dune in a sense. And he meditates with Manjusuri and Sakyamuni and their disciples. And then he says, "Earth is such a beautiful realm, unlike the Saha or mundane land where I come from at Sirius, which was destroyed by an ancient war and was left as rubble, filth, mud, and mountains." He then bids Sakyamuni and Manjusuri farewell. He and his disciples again ascend into their flying palace, a tower of 7 layers, and once again, accompanied by the sounds of hundreds of thousands of musical instruments being played without players, he disappears and traverses across the dimensions of time and space back to Sirius. So you got to ask yourself, what is being described here? This is a physical spacecraft coming from another area of space.
Well, that's what I wanted to get into, your understanding of the nature of some of these. experiences that the ancients had, and there's profound correlations to even meditative and psychedelic experiences that I've
Right.
had and many others have had in our modern age, as well as quote-unquote extraterrestrial experiences and contact experiences. And I'm wondering if all of these are our consciousness accessing different layers beyond our perception where these intelligences may reside. What the ancients may have called gods are these ascended master beings that exist in these different realms, may always exist there. It's just within a different state of awareness and perception.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, we're so tactile with our five senses, taste, touch, smell, so on and so forth. Even with our eyesight, we only see such a fraction of what is available to us. And so I believe that there's a possibility that, much like our own bodies are kind of a nesting doll of different souls and different aspects, so is the cosmos around us. And so this is, again, these different chakra levels of the Mount Meru experience take you into these different dimensions. How can you access them? Well, in ancient times, people would go into deep states of meditation. And this would, today we're surrounded by so much technology, it's super hard to get into these states of meditation. All of our food is kind of set out to, in some aspect, poison us. And so we're calcifying our pineal gland and not allowing a lot of access to that. But when we go into a dream state, our pineal gland is what releases a lot of, or small trace amounts of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which allows our dream states to become incredibly realistic. And so what we take out of the dream is almost as real in memory as what we're doing in life right now. You go to sleep, or you have memories of your life. Well, you also have memories of your dreams. And so I think that, in the ancient times, we could access these planes of reality, these different dimensions, as we're discussing here, through deep states of meditation, through psychedelic practice of sorts, through these shamanic practices as well. And so it becomes an interesting aspect, because most of society is shut down and doesn't want to even talk about this. 15 years ago, we couldn't have the energy conversation. We're energy, we're whatever. Nowadays, people are coming up to me going, wow, did you know that they're discovering that we're, more energy than anything, and we live in an electric universe? And so we're starting to, tap into this again, I think, in our more modern times, but access to these realms is a lot more difficult because we're polluted around us by technology, by electricity, by all sorts of things that kind of disrupt that field or that access. Perhaps we could call it an Akashic record experience of sorts.
It also seems that the ancients' understanding of the cosmos, in a sense, related to our inner verse as well, as above, so below, that
Right.
our inner worlds, our inner consciousness, inner verse, is essentially a representation of the cosmos, but within our own consciousness. Would you say that's somewhat accurate?
I would. I mean, if you've ever seen brain scans about, how the different frequencies of the brain work, and they start taking photos of all this, it looks like we're looking into the cosmos, quite honestly. There's so many similarities there. And so, yeah, as above, so below. We are stardust. We are star seeds. So what happens out there happens in here. Everything is a reflection of itself. In Buddhism, you'd look in the mirror and you'd see Mara or Maya, in a sense, which is illusion, because you're looking at your reflection. You are looking at an illusion of yourself. And quite honestly, you're looking into the past, because it takes time for that reflection to get to you. And so how far back can you go? This is why, ancient shamans would scry, they'd look onto these black plates of obsidian, and they try and pull out imagery and bits and pieces from the future. And then they would bring all this back and relay it back to the tribe, and then try and figure, a pathway forward through difficult times.
Now, earlier you were mentioning some of the consciousness abilities that these Buddhist mystics were capable of, such as levitation. Tell us a little bit about what they were capable of as far as our ancient ancestors and their consciousness abilities.
I think a lot of it, especially the stories of levitation, come out of putting yourself into a higher frequency. We always, we hear this amongst a lot of the New Age community. You got to be in a higher frequency, but I think they had an ability to tap into that, and we're starting to discover some of this today using sound and sound waves, where we have, levitation of small objects. Well, if you can get into a sound meditation where you are chanting over and over and over again, there's a possibility that you're creating a frequency either around yourself or around an object that you're projecting at that would allow it to levitate.
Right on. And what are this some other abilities that you'd say that these these ancients were capable of that may manifest in a material or physical way?
I think longevity of life was a huge one. Somehow they had the ability to tap into some of these, aspects of the longevity of life. There's a couple characters' names are kind of slipping me at the moment who have had the ability to burn their handprint into rocks or their footprint into rocks in front of monasteries all over Nepal and India. And so this is interesting that there's a self an inner fire or an inner energy or flame that they have the ability to tap into, whereas others have self emulated themselves, lit themselves on fire, but not physically. It's like they have the ability to transform their physical being into an energy field of sorts. um Gonna say, when you get into like deep states of meditation, a lot of these people can go up into the high mountains, practically naked, and meditate in the high Himalayas on the glaciers. There's a spot in Nepal called Muktinath, and a lot of pilgrims will come there. And the whole idea is they strip down to their cloth, their mani cloth, and they will walk through 108 spigots of frozen water as a meditational form. And Wim Hof has kind of perfected this in modern times, where he has had the ability to go into glaciers and meditate for hours on end, or sit on top of the glacier itself and meditate. And this is known as a Buddhist inner fire. And so you're changing how your body works. I don't know if you've ever done any of Wim Hof's methodology. So I went to a men's retreat, and one of the things that we did was basically a cold plunge, and we sat in this freezing water for over a half hour. And I was amazed that the other guys in the group could perform this, because once you get in the water, you're freezing, you don't know what to do. But once you start getting into breath and inner breath and more relaxation, your body starts to create its own heat, because it's starting to use some of your reserves. And it's interesting, because some of the first stories that we hear of this outside of Buddhism is when Captain Cook sailed down and circumnavigated around Australia, and he ended up in Tasmania. Well, Tasmania is kind of in a subarctic zone. And during that time, the Tasmanians were cannibals, and they were naked running around the island. And here's Captain Cook bundled up for the South Pole going, how are these people naked cannibals? They haven't even perfected fire yet, but they had the ability to utilize their own strength and their own heat. And so I think that, we're starting to tap into some of these more ancient abilities, telekinesis, telepathy, these kind of things, also come into effect with meditation and levitation. And so, mind reading, people that can actually predict or see the future, people that are channeling other, entities or beings. These have all started coming out of like Theosophism. Around the 1900s, they were starting to get into some of this.
Yeah.
Where you have characters like Helena Blavatsky going into Tibet with her guide and tutor. His name was Jual Kul. And when he passed and she passed, her understudy Alice Bailey would channel all of Jual Kul's work and wrote a series of books off of channeling from this monk. I'm not super keen on a lot of the channeling that's going on today, but there's definitely something there. There's definitely something there.
Yeah, it is very interesting how we're starting to see this sort of spiritual revival of a lot of these concepts and understandings in certain circles. Now, before we move too far out of our discussion about our ancient ancestors, you've done some research into the lost mysteries of Kemet. Tell us a little bit about that.
So Another shameless plug here. So I wrote a second book called Lost Mysteries of Kemet, the Land Before the Greeks, basically. And so Kemet is what the ancients called, or Kem is what they called ancient Egypt. Egypt is a word that comes to us from the Greeks. Most of the history that we know of Egypt today comes to us from the Greeks. They conquered Egypt in around 323 BC when Alexander the Great came in and basically conquered, and then they started moving in and rewriting a lot of what they were learning about the ancient Cometian history. So the Cometians probably existed far back as before, like pre-dynastic times. They spoke a language called Suf, which is still spoken in the region. It's similar to Berber in a sense, and it's spoken now more in Mali and in Morocco and Algeria. But this was, a language that stemmed across most of this area of northern Africa, which in the ancient time was known as Kemet, or Kem, the land of the black soil. And so when the Greeks showed up in Memphis, which is a Greek name, it was called Min-Nefer, the fertile harmony, basically. They were shown a stele at a temple. And to them, they were told the stele read Het Ka Ptah, which basically translates to the physical manifestation of the creator god Ptah, a place where this Ptah could physically manifest. So this was a temple, but the Greeks saw it as Het Koptos. And so this is where we get the word Copto or Coptic from, which also means Ka Ptah, which is the physical body of the creator. Because your Ka is like your body double. I guess the only way to really describe it is if you're astral projecting or you're having an out-of-body experience and you're floating up at the ceiling and you're looking back at your body laying on the couch, your body laying on the couch is your Ka, but you floating up at the ceiling is your Ba, which is your spirit or your spirit form. And so there's this aspect that the creators could come in an actual physical form. Well, from Hepkaptos, the the Greeks turned that into Egyptos, and then Egyptos became Egypt. And so a lot of what we get out of from, a lot of the history of Egypt also comes, and Egyptology also comes out of Champollion, who famously transcribed the Rosetta Stone because it had hieroglyphic writing, it had diaretic Egyptian writing or Cometian writing, which is more of a hand script, and then it had Greek, and so they could translate the diaretic to Greek. But I have a hard time believing that he actually translated the Rosetta Stone, because more than half of it, especially the hieroglyphic part, is missing. And what we know of hieroglyphs are they don't adhere to A, B, C, D, E, like a physical alphabet, like the Latin languages do, English languages, Germanic languages do. They are more of a concept or a symbol that represents a concept, basically. And so you can take multiple symbols and put them together to create a new concept. I mean, we do this with sentences in a sense, and we do this with iconography, symbols, and logos, but the ancients were doing this with their own written language. And so Kemet, the word Kem or Kemet, comes to us from a grouped hieroglyph. And so on the left of the hieroglyph is what they call the irrigation berm. Then you have the owl. Then you have the half-dome sky of Nut, which is the sky above us, the night and daytime sky. And then you have a circle with an X in it, because X marks the spot, of course. But the circle with the X in it means the place of. And so the owl represents knowledge and darkness. The irrigation berm represents, the fertility of the Nile. And this is all sitting underneath the sky of Nut. And so this is Kem or Kemet. And when the Arabs took over Egypt, basically around 600 AD in a sense, they started using some of the old Suf words with their own Arabic words. And so Kemet is where we get the words chemistry, chemo, and other words, alchemy. These words all come out of this word Kemet. And it's interesting because the black alluvial soil is very rich in alchemical processes. You can, take the alchemical processes, you take the prima materia, this black, rich alluvial soil, you take the water, the sacred water of life, and then you take fire. And when you boil all this down, you're left with different stages of what the alchemists were trying to find as the philosopher's stone, or monoatomic elements. all the way down to mana, or this gold element that they were eating and they were using. There's a possibility because mana, when you weigh it, it becomes weightless. And so if you're using mana in a lot of technology or in a lot of spiritual objects, there's a possibility that they could also have some sort of a weightlessness to them. And so there's definitely, magic and mystery and mysticism that comes out of, the ancient Cometian practices as well. And so a lot of the Greek words, that we hear today, we use them all day long. And so this tells me how much of a scholar, these Egyptologists and people researching in the Egypt are. If they're constantly using the Greek names and the Greek history, they haven't really done their research.
Right.
And so you have characters like Osiris. Well, that's not Osiris's name. That was a Greek name. Anything that ends in is the Greekification. And so Osiris was known as Wisir, and this is where we get the words wise or wiseman from, Wisir. And the land around the Great Pyramids was known as Bu-Wisir, the land of the wise, basically. His consort was Isis. Well, that wasn't her name either. It was Aset. And she represents the fertility of water, basically, or the harmony of water in a sense. We have Ramses. Well, that wasn't his name. His name was Ramasu. Well, Ramasu means the rebirth of the sun. Heliopolis, which is the city of the sun to the Greeks, was known as Un or On, which is also the city of the sun, but they changed it to Heliopolis. Memphis, Men Nefer, the fertile harmony, because Nefer means harmony, and Min was the netter or god of fertility. You have Tanis. Tanis was originally called Djanet, and so on and so forth. And so all these names start to they have a different meaning, and they're more of titles when you look at them in the Suf or Cometian language versus what the Greeks had altered. The other aspect was the Greeks kind of misread how the ruling classes were ruling over ancient Egypt or Kemet. Today, scholars will call them all pharaohs. Well, this is totally incorrect. A good scholar will say in the time of Pharaoh, there was King so-and-so, King Tut, King Ramses, King Tutmosis, King Akhenaten, because they were all kings, and they're buried in the valley of the kings, not the valley of the pharaohs. But more modern scholars are lazy, and they call them all pharaohs. Well, the word pharaoh comes from the word per-ah, and per-ah was known as the house or the high house, and it was the house of the woman. And so the pharaoh is actually a woman's title, not a man's. And all of the kings were selected as consorts to their queens by the high priestesses of Aset, Hatshepsut, and Hathor, and they would select their king. And it's interesting because you see in a lot of the ancient sculptures coming out of Egypt, the women will have their arms around the man, as if to say, this is mine. Today, we're all sleazy, hey, babe, I got my arm around you, whatever. It's a whole different story. But the Greeks, because they had a patrilineage society, saw the Egyptian society as the same. They didn't recognize that there was a matriarchy society there. And by matriarchy, I don't mean the complete opposite of patriarchy, where women are in control and they're doing the same things that men are doing today. No, it was more of a unity project, right? So the women ruled over the fertility of the land and the fertility of the people. And the men ruled over the physicality of the land and the physicality of the people. And together, that's how they ruled, because those two aspects have to come together in harmony, in a sense.
There's more and more archaeological evidence being found that this civilization may have been a global type of civilization. They were even found in the Americas, possibly?
Sure. So now we're getting into the the mysteries of Atlantis, the dirty word amongst archaeologists and anthropologists. I have an interesting take on Atlantis. I don't think it was a physical place. I think it was a physical time. Because when you read Plato's work, the Critias and the Timaeus, he talks about there being 5 capitals around the entire globe. And so this is your global civilization, where Poseidon was the capital that sunk. And in our legends today, we say, oh, Atlantis sank into the ocean. Well, this was Poseidon. This was the capital city, one of the capital cities of this global civilization. Well, if you look at the time period that the civilization existed, we were deep in an ice age. And so I'm here in Portland, Oregon. Most of the area around me and across the globe, all the way down to basically where I'm living, was 2-mile thick ice sheets. So this would have sucked up a lot of the global oceans and made the oceans a lot shallower and therefore a lot more accessible by boat systems or other technology, as there's a possibility of that in ancient Atlantean times. And then we were hit by the Younger Dryas Comet event, the Halcyon Comet. It broke up over the ice sheets, melted down most of them, and spread debris all the way from pretty much Alaska into the Middle East. And so some of this debris splashed up and over from the Mediterranean into northern Africa, which was all jungle during this time. And because of all the salt water, it destroyed the jungle and basically turned most of North Africa into a giant desert, which we see today. But in ancient times, this was a lush jungle. And this area was very, very full of water. And we see this because Robert Schoch talks about the water damage in the encasement walls of the Sphinx. But if you actually stand there and you look at the pyramids, you can see water damage on all three of the pyramids about 2/3 of the way up. And so at some point, massive amounts of water flooded this area, which could have been from this meteor or comet event spilling up and over the northern shore of Africa. Yeah. But when this happened, there was a mass exodus from these 5 capitals. And one of the exoduses took the ancients to what is now today Giza and the pyramids. And so you find 2 depictions of this in Egypt. If you go to Karnak on one of the back walls, Karnak is such an amazingly large spot. You could spend a week there and not see half of it. I mean, it's huge. Kind of like Chichen Itza. They just keep finding more and more and more and realizing, wow, okay, this site was huge. But on one of the back walls shows the exodus from Atlantis coming to the lands of. And when you go to the Edfu temple, you also find the same description there. And so they're describing this ancient, more sophisticated race of people coming out of this disaster period. And as the myths and legends around the world go, there were these great seafarers that came out of the sea and helped rebuild civilization, in a sense. And so they taught people how to homestead animals, how to garden, how to plant crops, and how to basically create a civilization out of nothing. And so part of this civilization, and this gets into some of Walter Bosley's work as well, we call chem or com. And so this is interesting. This has a relation to chem and kemet. So the com, as I know them, existed in far eastern Tibet. And so this is now considered central China, but before the Chinese invasion, this was all central or far eastern Tibet, and it was called Com Tibet. But the Com empires stretched literally from Iran and the Middle East all the way into Polynesia and these areas. And we find evidence of this. But as you were saying, we also find evidence across the seas. There's this rumored series of caves in the Grand Canyon where they found both Egyptian and Buddhist of sorts sculptures. And so this could be this calm culture coming to the Americas. And we're told that, the oceans were barriers. They weren't highways, but in reality, the ancients were crossing the oceans. I mean, we have knowledge of this. In 232 BC, a Greco-Egyptian admiral named Mahui traveled from basically Kemet, or Egypt at that point, through the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. He circumnavigated, again, Australia and ended up on the north shore of New Zealand, where there are depictions of him and his travels. In Polynesia, there's also the cave of called the Cave of the Traveler, I believe, and in it are hieroglyphs, are cave carvings and petroglyphs on the wall that also describe this Admiral Mahui and his captain Rata. So they crossed basically across to New Zealand and this whole area of Polynesia, in a sense. But they would have caught the trade currents, which would have taken them literally across the Pacific Ocean and landed them around Santiago de Chile. The trade currents then would have taken them all the way up the coast to Peru, in a sense, across Easter Island, which Thor Heyerdahl discovered during Kon-Tiki, that he could build these reed crafts, put them off at Paracas. He didn't even need to put up his sails. And within a few days' time, he ended up at Easter Island. And you can then follow those trade currents up to Hawaii. You can follow them all the way across to the Americas, to Central America, and all the way up the western coast of the Americas to Alaska, and then back to Hawaii. And this is how all of these trade currents and winds work. And so the possibility that they crossed all the way into the Americas is very strong. I mean, we find evidence of Egypt or ancient Chem in Peru. We find evidence of the Phoenicians in Bolivia. And so how are these artifacts being dug up in these, foreign lands if we never crossed the oceans?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about Mahui is he's also considered one of these gods of the oceans that came out and helped unify Polynesian people, basically. And they call him Maui. He's the god of the sea. And he came to them and helped unify all their peoples. And we realize this because a lot of the Native American art you find all the way up the west coast of the Americas into Alaska is very similar to what we find in Hawaiian art, like native art, and also Polynesian art, and also Maori art in New Zealand. And so there's definitely a connection there. Well, this is 232 BC. Well, 2300 BC, we have two brothers who are doing trade with Australia. And they came to Australia with a bunch of ships and were trading items and artifacts with the native population, the indigenous Aborigines of Australia, in a sense. And when they left the east coast around Sydney to travel up through basically Thailand and Indonesia and that whole area, sticking close to the shorelines, they got into a horrific storm. And one of the two ships capsized. One of the two brothers was killed. The other one made it back to Australia outside of Sydney, and he went up into this region just outside of Sydney called Gosford. And in a ravine on both walls, he inscribed in a kind of a chicken scratch hieroglyphic form his trades with the indigenous people, how they went, and then an homage to his brother who he lost during these travels. And so this is, 2500 BC, in a sense, that we're having these trade routes with Australia. So obviously they were crossing the oceans in ancient times. It's a no-brainer. And from that, about 800 years later, we have King Tut, right? Well, when Carter found King Tut's tomb, he found hundreds of hunting boomerangs. Well, where do the boomerangs come from? They come from Australia. So there's this obviousness that we definitely were traveling. Some scholars say the Gosford glyphs are fakes, but we've had 3 independent researchers that are hieroglyphic experts go there and actually transcribe them. And the reason why they're called fakes is because they're in this chicken scratch format versus what we see in Egypt, where they're beautifully done on the walls of all the temples. Well, that's an artisan, and this is a commoner. There's a big difference between the two different styles. And so we definitely were crossing the oceans in ancient times. When you go to a site like Chichen Itza in the Mayan territories in Mexico, you go past the observatory and you go into an area that most tour guides won't take you. I was there in March on a Templar tour with Grandmaster Timothy Hogan, and he showed us an interesting temple set that, again, these tour guides just don't take you over to. And the temple, there's 2 temples. One of them has very obvious elephant motifs around it. Well, there weren't elephants in the New World. There were mammoths, 10,000 plus years ago, but there weren't elephants. And so these elephant motifs definitely scream this calm culture coming out of Asia where there were elephants. When you go around the corner to the second temple, sitting above the lintel of the opening of the temple, in clear daylight, is a character sitting in lotus position meditating. And so this is, again, this calm or Buddhist, philosophy that comes out of both, Central Asia, and interestingly, some of the oldest yoga techniques are found in Egypt, depicted on the walls. Some of the hardest yoga poses to get into, like when you're making namaste with your feet inverted while you're sitting in lotus position, is next to impossible unless you've mastered, yogic meditation where you can contort your body into just about anything. Yeah. And so I firmly believe there is an overlap between these Asian cultures and the Americas. Whether or not we'll ever be able to see what was in these caves, who knows? Yeah. Maybe the Smithsonian will open their boxes.
Well, it is an exciting time for these discoveries about our ancient past, especially due to a lot of the research that people like yourself and other independent researchers are doing. Now, I'd like to switch gears a little bit for the next half of the show and
Sure.
talk about your research into AI symbology in movies and occult symbology in general.
Well, symbology is kind of interesting because we've had certain symbols that have come to us throughout the course of time. One of the oldest symbols that has been recognized in a sense comes from the triangle, the circle, and the square. And so to the ancient Zen Buddhists, this was considered a depiction of the universe. It as above, so below. To the Zoroastrians, this was known as a depiction of the human. And human is an interesting word because it is a etymological symbology that comes from two words: hue, meaning color or colored, and man, which represents all of us. So the hue man is the colored man, which is all of us. But one of the oldest symbols that comes out of ancient times was that of the worship of Saturn and all the different aspects of Saturn. To the Greeks, it was Kronos. To the Romans, it was Saturn. Basically, Rome used to be called Saturnalia or Saturnia, and during the winter solstice or just after harvest, they would have a giant feast called Saturnalia, which is a 3-day event that takes place around the winter solstice. And this basically got corrupted and became our Christmas holiday of today. But in ancient times, this was called Saturnalia. And even the slaves were allowed to sit with their masters and, have table service and dancing and everything that was going on, wine, the whole 9 yards. And so Saturn and Kronos started shifting into other cultures. So the Greeks called him Kronos. He was the god of all gods, right? The creator god. And he's always depicted eating his children. And so there was a lot, unfortunately, in ancient times of child sacrifice to this god Kronos or Saturn. In the night sky, it's thought that we possibly were a little bit closer to Saturn, or without all the light pollution, we could see it differently. And so they saw Saturn as a winged disk or a bull with horns. And so Kronos then becomes Baal, right? And so Baal is interesting because, Baal is somewhat older than Saturn and Kronos, but this is how we're looking at Saturn as well. And Baal then becomes El in both, Christianity and Hebrew aspects. And these worships and these sacrifices are still taking place throughout, the ancient times. Well, flash forward to today, and you start looking at all these AI logos and AI symbologies and logos in general around corporations that are dealing with technology, that are dealing with travel, and that are dealing with space. And most all of their logos are Saturnian logos. And so this worship of Saturn has come to us throughout the ages and is still with us today, guiding the way.
Right.
And it's usually depicted, Saturn had a bunch of, the number one depiction of Saturn is the cube, the black cube, basically, or the hexagon or hexagram. So the hexagram is what we know as the Star of David. This was also Solomon's seal. And so he took brass and interwove it with iron. And the energy field that would be created by both of these counter-rotating would be how he ensnared demons and trapped them or helped protect angelic beings. And so Solomon had a series of sigils that he would use to capture and ensnare golems, in a sense, or these demons and angelic beings. But today we're using a lot of Solomon's seals in our technology. These things are ensnaring and entrapping us through circuitry and through other aspects. And it's interesting that we're still using some form of this magic or technology. But the hexagon is also interesting because how did we know that Saturn was related to the hexagon? Well, when we sent the Voyager spacecrafts out into space, basically, and we'll get into that here in a bit when we talk about NASA, they took photos of Saturn, and the north and south pole of Saturn has two counter-rotating hexagonal storms, one within the other. And it's like, what is that all about? How is there a hexagonal storm on Saturn? And so Saturn became, known and associated with hexagons from the early time, even with cubes. And so the black cube was also considered a representation of the dimensionality of Saturn. And this is interesting because you get into Mecca, And the Muslim pilgrims will go to Mecca once in their lifetime, and they'll circumnavigate the Kaaba building, which is the black cube, and they'll circumnavigate it 7 times counterclockwise, just like Saturn's rings are going around Saturn counterclockwise. And you eventually make your way into the eastern corner. And sitting in the eastern corner during your Hajj, which is usually end of June, early July, this is when Sirius rises above the horizon. You have the Kaaba stone, and the Kaaba stone is considered a representation of the Sintamani stone as well. It's a piece of meteorite that fell from Sirius about 10,000 or 20,000 years ago. It was collected. It brings prosperity and good fortune to those who have the ability to touch it or get close to it. And so it became this religious artifact for Muslims. But it's interesting because it sits inside of a silver yoni. And so here you have Saturnian symbology with the black cube, the Kaaba, which is interesting because here's your physical body and your spirit in one word, Kaaba. And so you have your Saturnian symbology there. You have your goddess symbology with the silver yoni. And then you have your Sirius symbology with this Kaaba stone or piece of the Sintamani stone that sits in Mecca. And it's interesting because this site was usurped by Muslims. Originally, the black cube building was commissioned by the Queen of Sheba. And so this takes this back even further into more Solomonic and Saturnian magic. And so we keep finding these Saturnian symbols showing up over and over and over and over and over. So what is the fascination with Saturn, basically?
As far as the Saturnian symbolism and everything that you were just discussing that permeates, especially through our Hollywood media and culture, maybe you could give us some examples of what you've seen in movies and entertainment that relate to this symbolism.
We see Saturnian symbology in movies, and we also see Sirius symbology in movies. Saturnian symbology in movies, takes us back. Wow. God, this could even go back to Metropolis, which is like one of the first movies Fritz Lang did in the early 1900s about an automaton being that he creates, this female robot that strangely looks a lot like C3PO. But he has created her to become the first sex bot for the elites. So this is our first introduction to AI. Yeah. And so he is also in this, in the movie, there's a lot of Saturnian symbology around, black cube in a sense. There's the pentagram and the hexagram also being displayed throughout. But we flash forward into more modern movies, and you look at a movie like Alien. So in Alien, they end up at LV-426, which is a binary star system. So the binary star system shows up in movies quite often. Well, the only binary star system that we've really been told about throughout most of history is Sirius. We didn't even discover that until, the early 1900s. Anyway, the Dogons in Africa knew about Sirius long before we discovered that there was a binary star system there. But this binary star system keeps showing up in movies, as does the planet with rings around it, okay? And so LV-426 is a moon in front of a planet that has rings around it, much like Saturn. So you have a Saturnian symbology there. You have Saturnian symbology in 2001: A Space Odyssey. You have the monolith. This is also a representation of the black cube, in a sense. You get into more modern movies, for instance, all of the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures series, right? Okay. So in the first Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures series movie, you look at the movie poster and you have Earth, the Moon, and Saturn on the movie poster. And so what are they doing? They're flying around in this cube throughout time. So there's this time travel element, which is always associated with Saturn. And they're collecting all these characters from all over time in a phone booth. Well, there's your cube, in a sense, this device that can take them through time to help the future. Okay. So then you look at the second Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure movie, Bogus Journey. What happens? They die. Well, where do they end up? They end up palling around with Death, or Kronos, who's always depicted as the Grim Reaper because he is the god of the harvest. And so you have this harvest aspect with the Grim Reaper. That's what, you reap what you sow. This is where you get this scenario from. So Saturn comes out in the fall, and it stretches pretty much into the spring before it's not as visible in the night sky. And so this is known as the harvest star, or the harvest planet, in a sense. And so you plant your seeds in the spring, and then you reap the rewards in the fall, and then you have your Saturnian fall harvest. Okay, so they're palling around with death, basically, the Grim Reaper, a Saturnian symbology. So then you get into the third one, and they're having to, with their children, they're having to recreate the music of the future to help save humanity. And by doing so, they call in the planets at the end of the movie. And so what's the planet that comes in over the moon? Saturn, So it's right there. Even in Arthur C. Clarke's version of the Sentinel, I guess it would be the Sentinel, which is what 2001 was written from. The monolith in the movie shows up around Jupiter because we couldn't figure out how to do the rings of Saturn back in the 60s. But in the book, the monolith shows up at Saturn. Okay. So then we get into movies like Interstellar. What's Interstellar about? Well, we got the black cube with TARS, the robot. Here's your black cube representation. And where does this wormhole, or this black hole that they go through, where does it show up? It shows up in the orbit of Saturn. So here we have this connection to Saturn again with this black hole. And once the movie is over, where is Cooper Station? Where does Cooper end up at? Well, he ends up at New Earth, which is Cooper Station, which is orbiting Saturn. So Saturn keeps coming up over and over and over again. And actually, in my book, The Magic of Symbols, in the back of it, I have pretty much a whole chapter on movie symbology relating around Saturn. And so, here's the Sentinel and the depictions of time and space, and the Tesseract, that's another cube. A lot of the logos associated with Saturn, in a sense, they're all cubes, or they're all winged or ringed planet systems. And so, I mean, it's right in front of you. Once you see it, you're not going to unsee it.
I'm sure a lot of this stuff is intentionally placed in our media, but I wonder if a lot of it is just something that is picked up through the subconscious. These powerful archetypal images like Saturn and the black cube may be such a powerful piece of information that permeates through the Akashic records or the unseen information field, that when we are being creative, somehow we pick up on that, and it comes out in various pieces of cinema and art, multiple creative aspects over the years.
That's interesting you say that, because I think unintentionally David Icke, he kind of tapped into this as well, and it's like an interview and a documentary that he did years ago, but it's hard to find online now. But it's called the Saturn Moon Matrix, basically. And so if you look at Saturn, and you look at the rings of Saturn, and you look at these hexagonal storms on Saturn, it creates a lot of noise in the cosmos. When we sent Cassini there, it recorded, this very eerie sound coming off of Saturn, basically. And so Saturn could be looked at as a giant radio telescope of sorts, where our moon, this is David Icke's work, of course, our moon is a receptor for that. And because of this radio transmission and receptor, it kind of traps us here on Earth. The moon is very much what keeps us all alive, in a sense. Without the moon, we don't have the tides, we don't have tidal forces, we don't have seasons. None of this would exist without our moon. And so in a sense, it's a guide for good, but it's also a way of trapping us here. And as many philosophies talk, when we die, our souls are repurposed and go back into the cosmos or the ether or the Akashic record, only to be reborn again. And so the thought is Saturn and the moon a soul collector that then recycles our energy back into another physical form? I'm sure there is some aspect to that when you go into deepened states of transcendental meditation or shamanic practices. You are calling some of these symbols and symbologies out of that ether and making them present here.
Now, with the last few minutes we have, I'd love to hear some of your research into NASA trickery, possibly.
Okay,
Allegedly.
here we go. I might need to share my screen with us.
Sure.
So, NASA. NASA is a very, very interesting scenario. Okay. When we started going into, as I said, I'm not here to bash on NASA. NASA was very instrumental in 2015 with helping me out and a lot of Nepal out because I got access to NASA basically to help with the earthquake zones. And we were trying to take GIS satellite photos of where the roads were washed out because I was working with a bunch of different groups trying to send supplies to the most affected villages during the two massive earthquakes in 2015. So my connection at NASA was very instrumental in helping out with that. However, they definitely have some interesting anomalies within their own space programs. So Mars is a huge interest to me and has been since I was a child. There's something about Mars that has completely fascinated me. And so when we started sending the Viking missions in 1975 to Mars, we sent the Viking missions with several different scientific kits on them. One was in the rotating satellite and one was in the Viking lander. And these two kits in particular, one was set out to basically discover if there's water on Mars, and the other was to discover if there's bacterial life on Mars. And as Carl Sagan always said it, if we find bacteria out there in the cosmos outside of Earth that we have not brought with us, then the universe is teeming with life. So in 1975, we send the Viking explorer to Mars, and while it's there, it discovers moisture in the atmosphere and moisture around the poles of Mars. So they're discovering water in 1975, as well as they got a reaction with the bacterial trodes or scientific processes on both the lander and the orbiting satellite that showed that there was a reaction to the dust or something that created movement, and thus there was possibly bacteria there. Well, it's interesting because every time we've gone to Mars, we automatically discover water for the first time. Every single time we've gone to Mars, oh, we've discovered water. Well, you discovered water the first time you were there, and it's in both of these magazines shown here, or not magazines. These are the pamphlets that came out of the Viking mission. One is the mission guide, and the other one is more articles about it, and it basically describes what I just stated, that we found both this bacterial movement and moisture or condensation and water vapor from the instruments on both of these craft in 1975. Oh, wow. So that's the first anomaly of sorts. Another one that I have a weird query with is Voyager. So the Voyager craft is powered by what we see here on the left. This is about the size of I'd say a tennis can, and it's a nuclear pellet program. But it puts out as much wattage as the light bulb in your refrigerator does. So here we have, Voyager, now way out in the cosmos, billions of miles away from Earth, yet we're still able to hear its radio signals and send commands to it and then receive messages that the commands were executed, so on and so forth. I have problems with this, especially because the output of this device is the same as the light bulb in your fridge. Okay, finding a radio signal coming from Voyager would be like trying to find a cosmic fart in the universe, quite honestly. Yeah. And I'm super skeptical about aspects of Voyager because not only would it have had to have floated through the asteroid field, which is full of micrometeorites and debris, and miraculously went through it unscathed, but now it's out in the Oort cloud, which is full of micrometeorites and asteroids and frozen, solid masses. And how is it not destroyed? How have we created such a trajectory for it that it just glides by everything like a tourist and waves at the animals at the zoo without being destroyed? I mean, micrometeorites alone would have ripped this thing to parts years ago. And so I've been super skeptical about Voyager.
That's interesting.
Another interesting aspect that also comes out of this is couple of years ago, my father decided to reach out to me. He started getting a little bit interested in UFOs and crop circles and these things, an anthropologist, so he was never really into this stuff. But the more he reads into it, the more it becomes interesting. And so in the last 20 years, we've been receiving radio signals from a certain specter of perspective of space, in a sense. And I was on a panel in Las Vegas 2 weeks ago, and I brought this up. And Mike Barra and Brad Olson were like, well, why would aliens be using radio signals? Well, we use radio signals to communicate with the cosmos, so why wouldn't other civilizations that are intelligent out there be doing the same? And so it's interesting that we started receiving these fast bursts every 15 or every 55 minutes or something like this, these fast burst radio signals. And if you look at a movie like the movie Contact, what happened in Contact? Well, we started receiving these fast burst radio signals and realized that we were being sent a blueprint to create a 3D Merkaba technology object to send a physical or consciousness to Vega to talk to, our elders, in a sense. Jodie Foster's character is gone for 39 hours or something like this, but in reality, she went through the machine in the blink of an eye. And so again, there's this time delay with things. Well, we started receiving these signals from deep space, and then immediately after this, NASA comes out with this NASA-funded research creates synthetic DNA-like molecule to aid search for alien life. So if you can't physically cross the dimensions of time and space physically, you could do something like transpanspermia, where you send, bacteria, DNA on an asteroid that smashes into a planet. Or if you could find an intelligent race like us, I don't really consider us super intelligent, we're still playing with nuclear matches. You could send basically a DNA structure and a consciousness through these signals that then we would build into a DNA-like molecule and create a synthetic or artificial being that we could then implant an alien consciousness in, allegedly, or right, so to speak. So shortly after the DNA molecule comes out, all of a sudden in the news, this is from Forbes, at least 36 intelligent alien civilizations live in our galaxy. And they're communicating. Well, okay, are we part of that communication, or are we just eavesdropping on it? And so there's a possibility that, all this AI tech and all these, robots and autonomous beings and telepresence beings that we're now seeing being rolled out, at some point they want to, do a Neuralink aspect, right, where they're uploading our consciousness into these automatons so that we can then go explore space ourselves and possibly have more longevity of life. Well, what's to say that they haven't uploaded another, consciousness from an alien race into one of these things? And so when we start looking at, some of the rollout of, not trying to get controversial here, but like LGBTQ community, right, they keep adding letters and numbers and letters and numbers to this expression, and eventually they're going to get to X. And we're going to be so bombarded by the commonality of people being who they are around us, call it weird, call it queer, call it what you want, that it's going to be so commonplace that when they roll out gender X, which is the alien, it'll be, none of us will really notice that it's there around us in society, because we've been so conditioned by all of this, and now with AI even more so. And so this is another interesting NASA-based controversy, because it is basically these are some of the other articles that came out about this. But NASA is funding research, for life on Mars, and they're using this synthetic DNA that they magically discovered to help diagnose diseases and cure diseases. And so, like, what were we sent to these fast burst radio, signals, and from where? So that's another interesting NASA aspect that I've stumbled upon and have gotten
It's so
into.
funny. You have these articles that come out, you hear a little bit, there's a little hype for a few days or a week or so, and then you won't hear anything else about it. And then months or years later, we'll have this another hyped up article about UFOs or aliens come out, and then the collective just tends to let it drift away and forget it and becomes not a big deal. And you're absolutely right. It seems like they're just preparing us for any inevitable either contact, or if it is something that we create and self-impose, like the AI intelligence that you were talking about. We'll just think it's normal, everyday shit that we deal with now.
Right. So speaking of Mars, the other anomaly is it kind of comes out of the movie Total Recall, the original movie, not the new one, which is horrible. But in the original movie, when Quaid is, going into sleep, and they're going through his secret agenda mission that he's, they're planning the memories of. The technician goes, "Oh, blue skies on Mars. Well, this is interesting."
Yeah.
And then they move past it. And so there's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge to what they know, because when you get into Mars, we're shown Mars as this red planet. Well, they always put this red tint over everything to kind of show, oh, there's iron in the air and whatnot. But in reality, Mars has blue skies, just like Earth does. It has somewhat of an atmosphere, much like Earth does. Yes, it has a lot of, Martians, storms in a sense, which kick up a lot of this red dust. But they put the answers in plain sight. So here we have Curiosity, on the left with the fake color, and the real color being on the right. And how do we know it's the real color? Well, they give us these indicators. So on the right here is a color pad. And so in a camera, even in the lighting of supposed Mars, you would still see red, green, blue, and yellow on the color pad. But through their manipulation of the imagery, they wash it all out with this red tint, so you can't. And it's like the cameras wouldn't pick up the red tints on the left. They would pick up the color that you'd see on the right. And so this is an interesting anomaly with, NASA covering up what actually is on Mars. I believe there are blue skies on Mars, much like what we're being told. Another one is that we have this new second moon. We've discovered a second moon. Well, how many times have we discovered a second moon? I mean, more than 6 now. Here's 3 different examples of the second moon. I remember 10, 15 years ago, they're saying, wow, we have a second moon in front of our own moon. It's a smaller asteroid, but it's in the same, rotation around the planet as our moon. And so it was our second moon. But now we have another second moon all of a sudden, as if it's the first time we've ever had a second moon. And so that's been an interesting anomaly as well. The third one, another one here, I got into a little bit of a controversy over. So in the early 1950s, okay, this is how far back this goes, we invented the Lockheed SR-71, or what was known then as it's the A-112, something along these lines. Okay, this is in the 1950s. This is a supersonic aircraft that can leave our atmosphere and go into low orbits of space. If you read what this says here, this pilot fell free fall from space and lived to tell about it because his craft disintegrated in orbit. Well, what's interesting is they put out a series of drones on top of these crafts. They're called parasitic drones because they could take off and either land back on the craft or land, back on Earth. Most of these drones were set up with cameras, but you could fit a payload in them and you could fit 2 astronauts in them if you wanted to. And so what do we need the Saturn V rocket program for to get into space, or any of the rocket programs for that matter, when in the 1950s, long before any of this existed, we had an aircraft that could do all this without that expenditure. And so that has always been an interesting anomaly to me, is the SR-71 Blackbird, which they declassified when they decommissioned it in 1985. So this technology pre-existed NASA, but it's still one of these anomalies as to say, well, here we have, the D-21 and D-22B probes and the M21 prototype. Well, the M21 prototype was a probe or a drone that could take a physical pilot into orbit. And so right here we have this huge, interesting anomaly. My other favorite one is whoever put this one together is quite interesting. So supposedly we live in a galaxy. We don't know because of where we sit in our galaxy. All we see is the ecliptic. We don't see the actual circle of our galaxy. We just see the plane. And that's what we call the Milky Way. It could be our galaxy. It could be that we're in an arm or a ring around our galaxy. NASA and all these scientific, committees put out these wonderful posters in the early 80s. You are here, right? Well, this isn't even our galaxy. This is Andromeda. So first and foremost, interesting. But if this was our galaxy, you got to beg the question and ask yourself, where is camera?
Right, exactly.
How do they know where we are? How can they triangulate where we are in the cosmos? They
Right.
can't unless they're not telling us something, and we actually have gone out into the deepness of intergalactic space. And so this has always been an interesting anomaly as well for me with NASA. There's some interesting stuff with the International Space Station, where there's some hokery going on. Obviously,
Yeah,
there's this
if they can
famous
really do all this, why even fake any of it? I've seen some
right,
of the questionable ISS videos where, some things are floating, some things aren't. You see
right.
evidence that they're
This
faking things.
well, this is one that's interesting because I do a lot of 3D design as well. And so you would use meshes and grids to help build, 3D spatial aspects. Um, this astronaut is showing how a ball moves in zero gravity. And this was shown on a screen when they took George Herbert Walker Bush through NASA in his old age. Here he is in a wheelchair. It's shown on a screen in the background. And on the screen, you can see this section of material from inside of the ISS.
Yeah.
Well, on the picture of the right, here's this gentleman standing in front of the screen. Here he is standing in front of where that screen should be.
Yeah.
Okay. And that piece of equipment is what is sitting right here next to him.
Yeah.
And so, what is this? And so, this is where, a lot of people are like, oh, this is all flat earther stuff. They're just trying to prove, blah. This has nothing to do with flat earth.
Right.
This is just an anomaly that researchers have discovered that they are using blue screen technology. And we know blue and green screen. And we know this because they did all these scientific videos for children where they would reach up and grab something out of nothing and it would appear in their hand as this 3D object that was superimposed over the screen to help teach kids about some different aspects of what goes on in space.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that interesting because here in this kids program, you're showing that you're using, mapping technology in your videos, but then you're claiming you don't do this when you clearly are. The other one is these guys on ropes or harnesses, and there's a bunch of photos of the harnesses where here you can actually see where the harness is connected and it's pulling his shirt up.
Yeah.
There's another one where one of the astronauts drifts by in the background and he's clearly on a harness.
Yeah.
I've been trying to find that video. But a lot of people think that a lot of the interior shots of the ISS were taken inside of what is called the Vomit Comet. And so this is it's like a 747 sized airplane that goes way up into the atmosphere. And then they flip upside down and they cut the engines and you drop and it creates zero gravity. Okay. And this is how they train the astronauts. And the interiors of the ISS that we see are roughly the same interior size if you add in all this extra clutter of the inside of what they call the Vomit Comet. And so it's interesting that they do all this testing in this, near zero gravity environment so they can get used to the G-forces and whatnot. But the other anomaly is hair. And so you always see hair being, displayed in this huge, fanfare of chaos for people that are inside of the International Space Station. Well, this picture on the right is taken inside of the ISS. And nobody's hair is standing on end. All these guys, these gentlemen here in the front, all their hair should be literally standing on end,
except
similar to this, except for her.
Yeah.
And so it's weird. This woman, her ponytail should be standing on end as well. Okay. Well, here's a depiction of one of the astronauts. She's supposedly washing her hair in zero gravity, which is interesting because there are products here on Earth that can allow you to do your hair like this as well. And these are called like dry shampoos of sorts, and they create a grit. And you can basically feather up your hair into these, giant monstrosities, very similar to what you see these astronauts going through on the ISS. Now, a lot of the videos, obviously could be real, but there's a few that just pop out as just they shouldn't be there in a sense because they're showing us the fakery.
Yeah, I don't understand why they'd have some fake, some real. If they have the capabilities to do it, why not just show us that? What do you think about the actual moon landing?
So I'm in the camp that I'm sure we went there, but what we were shown on TV is very different, and it's interesting because in early 2005 on a Hindi space program, a Hindi website, basically blog site. They were talking about the possibility of ancient Vimanas on the moon. Well, in 2007, a bunch of articles and videos showed up online showing this, what we call the Mona Lisa on the moon, and how they discovered this derelict spacecraft on the backside of the moon. And possibly they sent the Apollo 18, 19, and 20 missions to the moon to discover this derelict aircraft. So this picture on the left in the lower portion comes from much older than these two stories that came out. And the two stories that came out are interesting because basically we're told that NASA scrapped 18, 19, and 20, the Apollo missions, in 1972. And they moved on to bigger and brighter fields. Well, what's interesting about this is the crews for these three missions were all trained. All the equipment had already been built and paid for. The rockets were already on the launch pads and fueled, and they canceled the mission. And what they replaced it with, interestingly, was the Skylab missions. Well, Skylab is interesting because it would have taken multiple launch vehicles to get Skylab into orbit, as well as the crew and all the equipment inside of it. And so the question with Skylab is, could they have masked other secret programs to go to the backside of the moon? Because during the Apollo 15 missions and the Apollo 10 missions, they photographed the dark side of the moon while the return capsule was still in orbit and the astronauts were on the moon. And there's, I guess, another quick anomaly about the moon landings that's really interesting. So we have satellites around Earth that can literally zoom into a logo on a golf ball in a parking lot, and tell you what it is. Okay, we have the same satellite technology on the LRO, or Lunar Reconnaissance Observatory satellite or camera system that rotates around the moon. But whenever they show us the landing sites, it's like this little tiny white tic tac, That's where the Apollo landed. I'm like, you can zoom in on one of the stars on the flag and prove this to be real, but you don't. And the equipment is right there. So it's interesting because we're told that there was no joint Soviet, American, or NASA space programs in the 1970s. This is the height of the Cold War. There's no way we'd get into bed with our enemy and, go to the ultimate high ground. Yet the Skylab program was a joint Soviet-NASA program, and people don't really remember that. And so it's interesting because I started looking more into what is on the backside of the moon and what aren't we being told about, because at some point we're being shown and told that on the lip of a crater there is possibly a derelict spacecraft that, in my research, kind of relates to the Dropa, because here's this cigar-shaped spacecraft that's between 2 and 5 kilometers in length that would have been considered a generational sleeper ship. And it's interesting that there are direct connections with this to Oumuamua, which was discovered in 2017, spinning end over end. It passes by Earth. It starts getting into, the sun's gravity. It slows down. It changes trajectory, and then speeds up to slingshot around the sun to go into another part of the galaxy. Well, the fact that it's spinning end over end means that there could be some sort of gravity inside of it if it were hollow. And the fact that it slowed down, changed the trajectory, and sped up to slingshot around the sun is interesting, because that implies it's being driven either artificially or by a physical being. And so here we have on the dark side of the moon a similar craft that the ancients thought was 1,000,000-year-old or whatever, Vimana, from the ancient Mahabharata days. And so I started looking for where on Earth this anomaly was. Well, it's at a place called Guest Crater. And Guest Crater is very interesting. So this is the Apollo 15 pan shot. This is what it actually looks like. I guess I could try and pause this. Okay, it's all washed out. It's totally washed out in the photos. But if you do a micro adjustment with the contrast, you pull out this object sitting next to Guest Crater on the lip of another crater. I haven't manipulated this photo at all. This is what happened when I just adjusted the darks, lights, and the contrast. And so it pulls out this object. Well, it's interesting because NASA basically sells its rights to its GIS satellite systems, which are rotating both the moon and Earth. And this is where we get Google Earth and Google Moon from. Well, if you look up Guest Crater on Google Moon, you will not find it named Guest Crater. And it's ironic that they would name this crater next to a derelict spacecraft, allegedly Guest crater. Yeah, it's named after an astronomer, but who's the guest, right?
Yeah.
However, if you look up the coordinates of guest crater, 19.79 degrees south by 117.39 degrees east, you'll find it. You'll find it on the moon because it's there. But if you look up the name of it, you'll never find it on Google Moon. And as you see here in this photo, it's also very washed out, similar to what we see in this photo. And so this has been a major anomaly that I've been looking into. And so here are the mission patches from the Apollo 18, 19, and 20. These are the official initial patches. And these are the Skylab patches. And as you see, the Skylab patches also, especially Skylab 2, have the Soviet and American, collaboration between these two superpowers that are in a Cold War with each other.
Yeah.
And so the question is, did we send secret space missions to the moon? I'm sure we have. I'm sure, we're not the only ones up there. But it's interesting that we lost all the technology conveniently. We lost all the original videos conveniently. They ended up in a dumpster at McDonald's in the middle of Nevada somewhere. Weird. We don't have the technology to go back, okay, which is also weird.
Yeah.
NASA has admitted with the Orion spacecraft that they've had to reinforce it because they'll be sending astronauts for the first time through the radiation belts. Well, didn't we send, 10 missions before? And so that one's been super anomalous. And then with this whole Mona Lisa on the moon and the secret Apollo 20 mission, well, again, in 2017, Reuters decided to do a fact check on this. And so this is what's really interesting about it, is they found this guy, Terry Spelth. This is like 20 years after he came out with his alleged videos and story of Apollo 20, the secret mission. And the only piece of evidence that he has is this really poorly made rubber mask that he says was the prop in the video and footage. But it doesn't look anything like the original photos of what we were shown from the original story. And Terry Spelth basically says, "Oh, somebody broke into my apartment and they stole all of my props and sets, and this is the only thing I have left." How convenient. Huh. So Reuters goes through and they're trying to debunk and fact check this whole, Apollo 20 space mission and Mona Lisa on the moon. And it's interesting because at the end of the article, it's a very short article, they conclude that it's 100% correct is what I say their fact check is, because in their fact check, they say there are no human remains, no sarcophagus, and no ancient human artifacts or ancient human ships have ever been found on the moon. Well, this is correct. We're not talking about ancient human ships and ancient human artifacts. We're talking about an extraterrestrial ship and extraterrestrial artifacts. And so to me, it's interesting that, Reuters would go through all the trouble to do a fact check that they got 100% right and 100% wrong. And so to me, that was super interesting that this came out. Yeah, this is, in 2022, December 15th. Mm-hmm. So shortly after this, AJ and Hecklefish did an episode on the Y-Files debunking the secret space mission as well. And so it's interesting that, in 2022 and early 2023, what narrative were they trying to get ahead of? Nothing against AJ and Y-Files. I love the stuff that they produce over there. But what narrative were they trying to get a hold of? Well, we had all this disclosure, from the CIA and from the Pentagon about, the Tic Tac craft and the fly fast or go fast craft. And we had these alleged whistleblowers that never really saw anything, but they knew somebody that knew somebody that knew somebody that had. And I'm talking about Grosh and even Lou Elizondo. And, both of these people have been propped up as mis and disinformation agents. This is what they did for, the intelligence agencies. They created mis and disinformation. Oh, I'm retired from that. Well, if you've ever met anybody that was a company player, let's just put it this way, you can never retire from the agencies, ever. You are constantly under watch. Yeah. And so this has kind of been, my go through and go to through all of, what we've discovered with some of the anomalies of NASA. I mean, there's so many more, but these are the ones that have, kind of stuck out to me in my research.
Right
Some of
on.
them could be completely false. Who knows? I mean, I'm open to that suggestion. I
Well,
go into my research with my BS meter in the red and hundreds of questions,
yeah.
and often trying to debunk things. And I come out of it with more questions than I went in with. My BS meter completely shattered, and me going shruggy shoulders because I don't really know how to express what I've just experienced. So anyway.
Yeah, no, this is great information, and we definitely have to question a lot of this stuff because there's too many inconsistencies and so much that just
Right.
doesn't make sense. So,
Right.
great research, Hans. Thank you so much. We only scratched the surface on a lot of this stuff, so I'd love
No,
to
we
have
can
you
get
back
into.
on
I would
in
love
the
to.
future.
Yeah, I
Definitely,
would love to.
definitely. Now, before we close out, remind the audience how they can find out more about you, pick up your books, etc.
So I have three books. I started with Dropa Legends and Lore. This is part of my upbringing in Nepal. A lot of my thesis study went into this, as well as my studies into the Dropa Legends and Lore, and then some of the stuff around the NASA anomalies that we just talked about. My second book was called The Magic of Symbols. We didn't really get into the three symbols, but there's a huge magical aspect to them, where I go through different symbols, whether they're objects, whether they're emoticons on our phones, or whether they're ancient, symbols from ancient times. I kind of tie all this together. All these books are introductory books. They go into somewhat of depth. And then the third book is obviously The Lost Mysteries of Kemet, The Land Before the Greeks, where I get into the studies of chematology and ancient Kemet. All these books can be found on lulu.com. I've been self-publishing them through that, but you can also find them and more of my research and work and my travels to both Peru and Egypt on my website, megalithic.mysteries.com, or Mega Mist as a shorthand of that. I own both of those domains. And you can purchase my books there, as well as some of the designs and shirts that I do. I do a lot of my own graphics and my own fashion stuff. And I will be speaking, excited about this, at Conscious Life Expo in February on
Nice.
Friday the 7th. I'll be in the rabbit hole room down in the basement at noon, and it'll be exciting. I'll get to meet back up with Jimmy Church and some of these other folks that I've been doing a lot of interviews and research with, and it'll be a good time. Looking forward to seeing whoever can come out. Please come out and support us in these endeavors. And going to these shows are amazing. And as Ryan Belly always says, it's much more exciting than TV and cable and streaming, because this is the real deal. This is unscripted, no advertisements. We're just there talking about our research, and there's going to be some amazing researchers there. And it's one of the largest conventions in the world around these topics. So that's how you can find me, megalithic.mysteries.com, or my books are at Lulu. They're decently priced, around $25. And some great information there for people that are getting into this and want an introductory to some of these topics that will take them
Excellent.
down so many rabbit holes.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, Chris, I really appreciate this. This has been great, and
Thank
I
you,
look
Hans.
forward to being on your podcast again.
Yeah, we'll definitely do it again. I'll have your website in the description. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow.